Daf Chav Ches Amud Aleph will begin Chav Zayin Amud Beis, the Mishnah. Kol hayotze min ha'etz ein madlikin bo al pishta. Anything that comes from a tree, that you take from a tree, you cannot use it for a wick, ein madlikin bo al pishta, except for flax. Otherwise, you can't use what comes from a tree. The flame does not burn properly; it jumps, and it doesn't burn smoothly. So it can't be used for a wick for Hadlakas Neros for Shabbos. Rashi mentions that included in that is cotton. Cotton is also from a plant. It's considered growing from a tree. Taisus argues on that because cotton is very good for wicks. It's usable for wicks and it burns very well. So Taisus says it means it's like cedar bast, the underside of the bark of a tree, the soft part of it, like from a cedar tree, different types of trees that have soft underside of the bark, the cedar bast, etc. That can't be used for wicks, but he says that cotton is not considered a tree, and that could be used. So kol hayotze min ha'etz ein madlikin bo al pishtan, v'chol hayotze min ha'etz ein metam tumas oil al pishtan. And whatever comes from a tree is not metam tumas oilim. Something that is under a roof, any kind of anything that's under a roof, that if there's tuma under a roof and there's any items there in the room as well under that roof, becomes tomei. The oil itself, the roof itself, also becomes tomei. However, the Mishnah is saying that kol hayotze min ha'etz, what comes from wood, that itself, that roof is not tomei. A tent is tamei. Not only what's under the oil is tamei, but the tent itself, the roof itself, is tamei, but not what's made out of wood. Most Rishonim learn this to mean that we're not talking about something that is mechuber lekarka, and Taisus happens to argue with that. He says we are talking about a mechuber lekarka, but most of Rishonim learn we're talking about something that's not mechuber lekarka, because something mechuber lekarka is not makabel tuma. We're talking about things that it's a movable roof. It's something that's put over the walls, not on a permanent basis. It's on a temporary basis. And most of them learn that we're talking about it's not designated it is rather designated to be for a roof and not designated to be a keli, not to be kalim. Something like that, something that is designated to be a roof, it's not makabel tumas oilim. It's not tomei if it's made out of wood. That itself is not. If it's made out of wood, it's not itself makabel tuma. So the Gemara Manon the Pishtan creates. So it says kol hayotze min ha'etz ein madlikin bo al pishtan, which implies that pishtan is called yotze min ha'etz. Min dalin the Pishtan creates Amar Marasuta Damar Kroa v'hi alosam agaga v'titam pishtei eitz. It says by Rocha Vasaina that she took the meraglim and she hid them b'pishtei ha'etz in the flax, in the stalks of the flax, which is called pishtei eitz. So you see that flax is called eitz. How do we know that? We learn out Xer Shava from the Mishkan. It says Lagabe Tuma. Lagabe Tuma's oil. It says Adam ki yomus ba'oil ksiv hasan. And it says by the Mishkan vayirvis as oil ala Mishkan. And it said that he spread the oil on the Mishkan. Malhalan shall pishtan kori oil, just like over there. We know that what was used for the threads to make the material for the mishkan, for the tent, was made out of linen, was pishtan. So avkan shall pishtan. So similarly, the oil, the reference to the oil by tuma is also made out of pishtan. That is called, therefore it's pishtan, and therefore it's called an oil, and it's makabel tumas mace. Avkan shall pishtan kori oil. Well, if you're learning out of the Mishkan and you're learning out the same material as the Mishkan, so why don't you say that just like the oil by the Mishkan not only was made out of fish, made out of linen, but it was twisted, the threads were twisted and had 6 strands. Each thread was made out of 6 strands. So similarly over here, maybe you should say also that the definition of an oil over here also has to have the same requirement. Where it says oil riva. It says oil, it says oil several times. It repeats the word oil to be marba, where marba even if it doesn't have those requirements. Well, then you should say marba everything, even things that are yotzim and eitz, not only pishtan. So the Gemara says no, you can't. The Gzera Shava has to teach us something. So therefore, we have a Gzera Shava that says the definition of an oil is like we find in the Mishkan. But we also have a ribo, so we're marba, therefore marba also, even if it doesn't have the specific requirements that had by the Mishkan, that it had to be 6 strands that were twisted, it doesn't have to be that, and it's also considered an oil, l'gabe tumas mes. Well, why don't you say, just like over there in the Mishkan, and it made out of kroshim, the Mishkan was made out of boards, so to here also say boards. Boards are also considered to be an oil and should be makabel tumas mes. We're saying kol yotzim min ha'etz in metamet tumas oilim. Any wood is not metamet tumas only pishtan. Amar krov asisa kroshim la Mishkan. You make kroshim for the Mishkan, which implies that the kroshim themselves are not considered a Mishkan. Mishkan kori Mishkan ve'ein kroshim, but kroshim ain't kroshim kroim Mishkan. The kroshim are not called. It's a oyo. It says vasisa kroshim la Mishkan. You make the kroshim for the Mishkan. Kroshim themselves, boards themselves, are not called a Mishkan. Well, the pasuk also says you make a michsa, a covering, oil for the oil. Maybe you should say therefore that the covering itself is not considered an oil. It's a michsa for the oil, but maybe the covering is not an oil. Elaha the boy Rabbi Elazar. How can you say that Rabbi Elazar had the shaila or behema tamei ma'ushi atame ba'oil? He had a shaila if the skins that come from a behema tamei. So if you have leather that's from a behema tamei, is that mitama boil? Does that mikabel tumas oil? Is that ma'ushi mitama oil maize? Is that mitama oil maize? So what's the shaila? If we're saying over here that vasisa kroshim la mishkan means that the kroshim are not a mishkan, similarly we should say that vasisa, when you make the michse, the covering, michsel oil, the michse is not called an oil. So what's the shaila? So hashta or behema tahor lemitama. If that's the case, even leather of bar, presumably the Mishkan was made out of a leather of skins of a behema tahira. Well, if we're saying that the michsa, the covering, the skins, is not called an oil, it's only a michsa for the Mishkan, but in itself is not the Mishkan, is not an oil. What's the shaila? Therefore, why was he asking? He had a shaila, Rabbi Elazar, if skins from a behema tzemeya are makabel tumas oil maize, even behema tahara should not be for makabel tumas maize, because we're saying therefore that the michse for the covering for the mishkan, the michse would not be considered to be the mishkan. So even the leather of the skins of a behema tahara should not be makabel tumas maize. So hashta or behema tahara lamitam or behema tamei boya. Where it says no, shiny hasam dahadar kro dechsiv and also as serious a mishkan. No, there the pasuk put it back into the category of the Mishkan, because it says v'noso siriyas ha-Mishkan v'es oil moyed michseu u'michsei ha-tachash asher olav, and it says so they carry the michsei or michsei ha-tachash. So therefore makish elin l'tachta ma tachtan kora oil, just like the bottom covering is an oil, that is the oil. So therefore af elyon, when it says the michseu and michsei ha-tachash asher olav, that's also considered an oil. Afelian kore oil, that's also called an oil. So therefore, there the pasuk reinstated it as therefore comparing the coverings one to another. That therefore the covering of on top of the Mishkan is considered an oil, and therefore could be mikabel tumas oil maize. But the kroshim were kroshim for the Mishkan, the krushim, the boards, they themselves are not considered in Mishkan, and therefore the boards are not Makabel Tumas Oil Mace. Gufa, boy Rabbi Ozri, had the Shaila or Behemoth Meya Shitama Tumas Oilim. Do we say that the skins from a Behemoth Meya is that Makabel Tumas Oilim? Frankly, more Maikami Boile, what's the Shaila? Amaravada Brahava, Tacha Shahi Bimi Moshe Kami Boile. His Shaila was the covering of the Mishkan, that we had this Tachash, that was the top covering of the Mishkan. His Shaila was, what was that made out of? We know that the covering of the Mishkan is considered an oil, and therefore we know that it could be Makabal Tumas Oil Maize, it's susceptible to Tumas Oil Maize. The question was, that Tachash that was in the Mishkan, that was used for the Mishkan, was that the skin for a Behemoth Tmeya or Behemoth Tahor? So that was the Shai. Was it Tomei or Tor? Amar of Yosef might have mighty boile. What's the Shaila? It says clearly in the Brisa that only things that can be used for the Mlechus of Mishkan is or Behemoth Tahor Bilvad. So it says clearly it has to be or Behemoth Tahor. Masiv Ravava Rav Yehuda Oimer Shnei Mechsois Hayu Shal Oiras Elim Adam and Vechas Shal Oiras Tchashim. He says that there were two coverings for the Mishkan. One was from the Elim Adomim, and one was the Oras. The top one was the Or of Tachash. And Rabbi Nechemi Yomer Masechet Shabbat, he said it was only one covering. It was only one covering. Half was made out of the Oras Elim Adomim. One was made from those skins, and the other half was made from the skin of the Tachash. And it looked like a Tala'ilan. A Tala'ilan is a non-kosher species. It's a type of cat that hangs on the trees with multicolored. And so we see clearly it says Tala'ilan, which we are assuming right now at this point, we're assuming what that means was that it was like a Tala'ilan, meaning it was made from the skins of a Tala'ilan, which is not kosher. And that's Tomei. So therefore, if it's doime like to the Tala'ilan, meaning it was a species similar to the Tala'ilan, which has multicolored, which was therefore not kosher, was Tmeya. And therefore, that was a Shaila. Therefore, we can see over here that was used for the building of the Mishkan was a Behemoth Tmeya. It says or Behemoth Tahor. Well, if that's the case, we will have to therefore interpret the Brisa to mean that what was used for the Mishkan in the avodah of the Mishkan was only a Behemoth Tahor, not a Behemoth Tmeya. But if the Tachash was a Tala'ilan, then we would have to understand that for the building of the Mishkan, they did use a Behemoth Tmeya. According to this understanding right now, we were saying that the Tachash was like a Tala'ilan, and a Tala'ilan is Behemoth Tmeya, and therefore, according to this understanding at the moment, we would be therefore saying that in the Mishkan they did use a Behemoth Tmeya. They used the Or of a Behemoth Tmeya. What does the Brisa therefore mean when it says or Behemoth Tahor Bilvad? Must mean in the avodah, in the service of it, in the karbonis, but not in the building of it. And what it says no, it's similar to Tala'ilan only in the respect to Sheyesh Boy Givanim Harbi. There was multicolored, but not in the actual skin itself, not in the species itself. Meaning the Gemara is now understanding that that it wasn't the skin of a Tala'ilan itself, it just was doima to the Tala'ilan. It looked like it in that it was multicolored, but it really was not the skin of a Tala'ilan. So kimin Tala'ilan sheish b'givanim harb v'loy Tala'ilan dil hasam tamei v'achat tor. Because for the Mishkan it was only Tor. Amar of Yosef v'hachi hainu d'metargamina sas gvana shesas b'gvanim harbe. And that's why the Targum on the Tachash is the Targum doesn't say that the Targum of a Tachash was a Tala'ilan. It does not metargum it as a Tala'ilan. It says that the Tachash is a saskvana, that it rejoices in its multicolored. So it only is similarity to the Tala'ilan is that it was multicolored, but not that it was actually the Tala'ilan, that it was the skin of that type of species. Rama says, how do I know that the skins that are metame, that are makabel tuma boiled maize, that if that was used for the oil, leather from a behemoth meya, how do I know it's makabel tuma boiled maize? We learn that from the following: the sanya or oy beor riva. So it says by neg, by tsaras, if the leprosy is developed in different types of materials, and it says it develops in different materials, and it says oy beor. Now it could have said, the pasuk could have said beor. Could have said there's a nega in wool garments, etc., and linen garments. It could have said beor. It says oy beor. So that's riba. So it's a marba, it's a riba. Riba or behema tmeya. So it's marba, the skins also, if leather made from behema tmeya. So that's our source for tuma by a nega. And it's also marba ushalaka biyad kain. And it's also marba that if after giving the garment to the kain to examine, if after giving it to develop the nega, it's also tami. Now why would I think otherwise? So Tosfos explains, because the pasuk says va'beged kiyeh boy neged saras v'hera ela kain, and then you give it to the kain, which is mashma. Tosfos says that the nega has to be there first. It has to be before giving to the kain. So I might have thought that it has to be literally the nega first before showing to the kain. How do I know that even if the nega is developed after giving it to the kain? We learn it out from oy beor. How do I know if I take all the materials and I make one covering, one garment out of all of the different materials? How do I know that's also makabel tumas saras? Talmud Leimer oy bechol melechas or. So therefore, I see by negoyim, even the skins, if it's leather made from tmeya, it's makabel tumas nega, and therefore, let's learn out from there with the binyan of that it's also makabel tumas oilam meis. In fact, more vikla mifrach. But you can ask a kasha. Mal negoyim sheken shliver metam behem. No, tumas negoyim has a chumrah, because even the threads designated to be woven, the warp and the woof threads, the shasi ve'erev, it's also makabel tuma, even if it's not a garment. Now that's something that's specific to tumas saras and negoyim. It doesn't apply to other cases. So therefore, the nega is chomer. How can I learn out from there? Yes, by nega, the aura behema tmeya is makabel tumas negoyim, but how can I learn that out to tumas oil base? Ella, the Gemara says, I'll learn it out from the tuma of shrotzim. And the sanya or ainli ela or. I only know that leather from a behemoth is makabel tumas sheretz or behemoth tmeya minayin. How do I know? Even by or behemoth tmeya, Talmud Leimer oy or. Also, we have a ribu oy or. It's marba. Also, the leather of a behemoth tmeya is makabel tumas shrotzim. So I'll learn out from there to tumas olam eitz. In fact, more vikla mifrach. But shrotzim also has its particular chumrah. Mal shrotzim shekem b'tam kadosha. It has its own chumrah that even if it's a kadosha, it's small like a lentil bean. It's even that tiny size. It also transmits the tumah. So Gemara says yes, but negoyim yochichu. But negoyim doesn't have that chumrah. So negoyim yochichu. Each one has its own chumrah. The goyim has its chumrah, sivera, and shrotzim has its chumrah, that it's even mekadosha. But the tzadashav behem, she'or tami behem. But the common denominator, the tzadashav, is that the leather from a behem is tami behem, and therefore va'osa or behema tmeyak or behemotar. Afani avi oil maize short tami boy. So just like I have just over there, leather is tame, skins are tame, and by negoim and shrotzim, it equates behema tavara and behema tameya, the leather from a behema tara and tameya are tame. So too, when I have oil maize or is metame, I should also similarly equate the or behema tara and the behema tameya. So therefore, we should say that just like over there, it's or shavem she'or tami behem, also or behema tameya or behema taraf, and even oil meish or tami boy v'nasa boy or behema tameya or behema tahara. So at this point, the Gemara is saying, let us learn it out from this tzad hashava, and therefore the or behema tameya should be metama b'oil meish, and the Gemara will continue with this discussion on the next Amud.
Shabbat.